This is the lecture for European history for Tuesday, the 12th of April, 2022. Where we've been is we were talking about the lovely, wonderful, idealistic Treaty of Versailles and the fact that unlike the Congress of Vienna, where the participants all had an understanding of what had gone wrong, French Revolution, what was wrong with the world, the Napoleonic Wars, what to do to fix it, prevent another revolution with the concert of Europe. There was no common consensus about what went wrong to cause the Great War. As a result, the clarity of the Congress of Vienna is completely missing from the Treaty of Versailles. And one of the results of this is that it is a Hydra-like treaty, and it has many different heads facing in many different directions. One of the strongest of the heads, one of the strongest influences, is American President Woodrow Wilson. And we talked about his thesis, his rationalistic college professor thesis, that what was wrong with Europe was unfulfilled, unrequited national self-determination. The idea that every culture or tribe of people should have its own political system independent of the others. And so, to the greatest extent possible, Wilson's system made as many national dreams come true as possible, with a couple of glaring exceptions. So, we go from the map that we knew, with the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Russian Empire, and the German Empire dominating Eastern Europe north of the Balkans, to the new post-war map. And largely, this is a result of Wilson's influences. So, in addition to Germany losing Alsace-Lorraine and northern Schleswig and Posen and West Prussia and the city of Danzig and part of Silesia, Austria, and in addition to Russia, losing Poland, parts of Lithuania, parts of White Russia, and parts of Ukraine, as well as Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and Finland. The Austro-Hungarian Empire is dissected, cut up like a Thanksgiving roast, into, the Italians get the Tyrol and Istria. They don't get as much of Fiume as they want. They're angry about this, remember. Austria becomes an independent nub nation. Hungary becomes an independent nub nation, but Hungary loses Transylvania to Romania. Romania also gets Bessarabia, which includes the modern nation of Moldova, because Romania had been an ally of the West, and it had been overrun as a result, so they were rewarded. Bulgaria loses some territory on the Aegean Sea because they were friendly to the Central Powers. Greece benefits from that. But the promises that Greece expected to control Ionia, or what is today Western Turkey, were violated when the Turks developed their own national movement, and under Kemal Ataturk, they drive the Greeks out. Serbia is one of the great exceptions to the Wilsonian ideal, because Serbia, remember, it was the Serbian, Bosnian Serb terrorist, Gavrilo Princip, who's the most effective terrorist in human history. His killing of Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie changed everything on Earth, caused the Great War, which changes everything in the world. So, Serbia is rewarded by being enlarged into the land, the kingdom of, and eventually just the nation of, the South Slavs, which is what the name Yugoslavia means. Yugoslavia means land of the South Slavs, and it includes Serbia, Kosovo, Macedonia, Montenegro, Croatia, Slovenia, Bosnia, and parts of what the Hungarians consider to be Hungary. So Serbia, far from being divided into its various little component nations, is made into an empire where the Serbs and the Croats dominate all the other groups. This isn't very Wilsonian, but Wilson doesn't have total power, number one. Number two, as we will discover to our horror in the 1990s, one of the most ethnically blended, multicultural quilts in the world is Yugoslavia. And the only way they are able to resolve some of their ethnic differences is through, a little genocide called ethnic cleansing. In other words, we are Serbs, we want to control this valley. How can we do it with so many Croats and Slovenes around, so many Muslims? Oh, I know. And, well, they do what is expected. So Yugoslavia is a violation of the Wilsonian principle. Here we have Czechoslovakia, which doesn't exist anymore because the Czechs and Slovaks don't particularly like one another. They don't particularly get along. They're like in Montana, there's an Indian reservation called Fort Peck. And on the Fort Peck reservation, which is huge, by the way, it's just a huge land area, they have two tribes that hate one another. And for whatever reason, the federal government placed the Assiniboine tribe, and I forget the other one. Does anyone know? Probably not. Anyway, these two tribes have a history of fighting one another. And the U.S. government, in its wisdom, decided, let's put them together on the same reservation. So it is a reservation that has amazingly high levels of violence, to the point where one of its places, Poplar, Montana, it has its nickname Stab City, because there are so many knife attacks. And part of the reason for so many knife attacks is that the two tribes don't like one another. The Czechs and Slovaks aren't quite that violent towards one another, but they're put together because Wilson's notion that the League of Nations would solve all the problems of little-bitty nations. Wilson's notion is not enough. The Treaty of Versailles says that there needs to be a stronger country here than either Czechia or Slovakia, so they're put together. So that's a combination nation. Yugoslavia is a big combination nation. Austria. Österreich. Eastern Empire. What culture is Austria? Yes, German. German. They wear lederhosen. They sing in beer halls and swing their steins. They're very compulsive about details. They're good at war. Yes, they have all the archetypical, stereotypical German traits because they are Germans. If you follow Wilson's logic, what should have happened to the German part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire? I'm going to roll the dice on this one. So, everyone listen closely to the question, because whoever gets rolled on is going to answer. If you follow Wilson's logic of national self-determination, what ought to happen to... Oh, my dice is not where it should be.
Where did it go? I know. I'm just killing it. I know.
What ought to happen? I'm sorry. Excuse me, Rory. You are number one. You may roll. If you get called on, it's Maddie's fault.
Big dice?
I don't know. I don't want to waste time. Okay, so 11. So you all know the question. Now we go to number 11. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Sir.
Well, if we're going to follow Wilson's logic, since the Austrians are very German, at least in culture, then Austria should be a part of Germany.
Yes! Very good. Following Wilsonian logic, the old Großdeutschland German society, which includes every group of Germans in Central Europe, should include Austria. But there's no way on God's green earth that the victorious powers in World War I are going to reward Germany with more territory. So to prevent Germany from benefiting from losing the war, Austria is kept separate. So these microstates are created as a fulfillment of the Wilsonian dream of national self-determination to a great extent, but not perfect. And what is the answer to the vast sucking sound of the power vacuum created between Germany and Russia by this constellation of microstates? What is Wilson's answer? We talked about this yesterday, and I'm rolling again. Mr. Smith, you get to roll. And you are number 1, Mr. Suslov. 12.
No.
What's going to guarantee the little bitty countries, the midget wrestlers of the European world? 12. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Natal. The League of Nations. See? I had no doubt that she knew. I had no doubt. The League of Nations is going to be the global law enforcement office to build a new world order based on law and not violence. Oh, how idealistic, Mr. Wilson. And because the League of Nations will be there, you can be a small nation in a dangerous neighborhood. You can be a midget wrestler between, we're big today. I think of Stone Cold Steve Austin and The Rock, but that's about 20 years out of date. John Cena, who loves China. He does. He frequently goes on and speaks on Chinese ads. And who else is big besides John Cena?
Donald Trump.
Donald Trump was in the wrestling ring. He fought Vince McMahon once. Yeah, about a decade ago. And he won. He beat Vince McMahon.
What?
It's true. Look it up on YouTube. It's funny. If you like that sort of thing. So you can afford to be a midget wrestler in the ring or in the arena with the others if and only if there is a League of Nations. That is Wilson's guarantor of the peace. But the French are not so willing to believe this. So what they set up, there are 2 names for it. Le Petit Entente, or the Little Entente. Now, remember what Entente means. Entente was the alliance that was pre-World War I between Russia, France, and Britain. So the Little Entente is, Le Petit Entente is a little alliance. And it includes Poland and Czechoslovakia and a number of other countries. And what is the function of Le Petit Entente, of the Little Entente? Well, it's to be, and I'm going to give you a French medical term, because I just love the French. It is going to be what is called a cordon, C-O-R-D-O-N, write it down, sanitaire, S-A-N-I-T-E-R-E. Cordon sanitaire, C-O-R-D-O-N, S-A-N-I-T-E-R-E. Now, a cordon sanitaire. Let's imagine that Miss Portia is being operated on.
Can I be the doctor?
You can be the doctor. I will have a priest standing by. Now,
Hey, I did good.
if I am approaching and I am not wearing a surgical mask or gloves, I'm not going to get close to her. Around her is a bubble, a cordon sanitaire, a sanitary zone that will prevent my nasty germs from infecting her open, exposed organs, right? So, what is the disease? The disease is Bolshevik Russian. And it is a communicable mental illness, communism. I've said it all the time. That's my personal opinion. You are allowed to disagree, but
I disagree.
yeah, you do that. So you have the Bolsheviks over here, and there has to be a sanitary zone to protect the rest of the world from them. So Le Petit Entente, the Little Entente, is designed as that cordon sanitaire, the sanitary zone, to keep the Bolsheviks as far east as possible. Bolsheviks. That's right. Okay. So, we are going to leave Mr. Wilson's idealism for now and next talk about the British. Are there any questions, comments, or thoughts, insights on Wilson before we do that? Because we're going to come back to Wilson. My least favorite president ever. Yes.
I have a question about Wilson, but it has to do with
Sure,
what you're saying.
sure.
So because they didn't want to give Austria to Germany, were there any other small, countries or places that they thought about combining, but they realized not to? I'm thinking of, the small places like Luxembourg or Liechtenstein or anything that's small like
Luxembourg was restored to independence. I honestly can't say why. I cannot. Look, Luxembourg still exists as a country. It's part of the European Union. It's one of what is called the Benelux countries, but it is still an independent country. I can't. Can you explain why?
They're wealthy people there. They want to enjoy having their
Please.
Okay, so Luxembourgers are a bit like the Swiss in that regard.
Luxembourgers.
They are!
That's
It's like Frankfurters are not just hot dogs, they are people from Frankfurt. And Hamburgers are people from the city of Hamburg. They're not just a ground beef sandwich.
I would rather
Thank
have a ground beef sandwich.
Let's
That
see.
sounds really good right now. Not gonna lie.
Well, look, Liechtenstein is still an independent country on the border of Switzerland and Austria. Portion. The German city, the German region of the Saar, Saar, is a coal mining town, and it was peeled away from Germany for about a dozen years. The French ran it, and after a dozen years, in I think 1932, the Germans and French who lived there were given a vote, a plebiscite, to determine whether they were going to join Germany or France, and they chose Germany overwhelmingly. But no, there were not a combination of the borders in Western Europe, except for Alsace-Lorraine, were pretty stable. It's Eastern Europe where these massive changes happened. Okay, Britain. You remember Britain in the Boer War. Britain fights this horribly bloody war against the Afrikaners, and they lose a lot of people to the commandos that are run by the Boers, the Afrikaner farmers in South Africa. How do they establish peace? You may recall that they have a generous peace, that the Boers are able to take part in politics very soon after the war. And because of this, between the end of the Anglo-Boer War in 1902 and the beginning of World War I in 1914, you have an Afrikaner, president and vice president of the Union of South Africa. And both of them had fought against the British. But when push comes to shove and the war begins, both of these former enemies of Britain fight to expand the British Empire and conquer German colonies in Africa. So having a generous peace is not only good sportsmanship, it's good policy. If somebody was going to be a productive member of the Roman Empire, the Romans would allow a generous peace. Generous peaces can really work. So on the one hand, much of the British leadership want to give Germany a generous peace. In fact, Lloyd George, the Prime Minister, wants to give Germany a generous peace. However, Lloyd George understands that the British Empire, which had been the dominant country before the First World War in the world, in terms of land area, population, biggest empire in human history, and had an economy in many ways second to none. I mean, the Germans had overtaken them in steel production, but in general terms, the British were still on top. And they bankrupted themselves to fight the war. To American banks. The British people were eating a poorer diet. British finances had less free money, much less. Somebody's got to pay for the war, Lloyd George says. And when he's running for office, like my beloved President Trump saying that Mexico will pay for the wall, it didn't happen. Lloyd George says that Germany will pay for the war. So the British Empire will be compensated for all of the expense and treasure that it spent because Germany will be made to pay for the war. But we're no longer in 1871. Me win, you lose, you pay because I tell you to pay is not good enough. Wilson's presence requires a veneer of legality. There's got to be a legal and moral reason why Germany should have to pay for the war. So as much as Lloyd George and the British want to, they cannot give Germany a generous peace completely because they've got to get Germany to pay for the war. With Wilson around, the only way they can get Germany to pay for the war is if Germany accepts guilt for causing the war. If Germany is proven to have the moral responsibility and legal responsibility for causing World War I, We can slap them with an indemnity. We can make them pay. So Britain has this schizophrenic duality because Britain needs Germany to pay for the war for the sake of its economy and for the sake of Lloyd George keeping an election promise. And that means that Germany needs to accept responsibility for causing the war. What's the problem with that? What's wrong with demanding that Germany accept responsibility for causing World War I? Haley?
Germany didn't cause war.
Right! Prinkipp kills Franz Ferdinand and his wife, the Serbians. The Austrians, under their chief of general staff, Konrad von Hotzendorf, overplay their hand and insist, among other things, on sending Austrian troops into Serbia to arrest and take into custody anyone responsible or involved with the assassination of the Archduke. So that's Hotzendorf and the Austrians. The Serbs are willing to give on every point because they've been caught assassinating the heir to the throne of a neighboring nation. But they can't allow Austrian troops on Serbian soil or they give up their sovereignty. You cannot be a country and not control your borders. That has some political controversy today, as it did then. So Serbia asks, who? Who is the big brother of the South Slavs? Because of Pan-Slavism.
Germany.
Serbian ally, also a Slavic nation.
Russia.
Yes. So the Serbs ask Russia, will you back us if we say no to the Austrian demands to send troops onto our soil? And Russian Foreign Minister Samsonov says, da, which is Russian for yes. So the Serbs say yes, 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 no to the various Austrian demands. So the Serbs assassinate, which causes the war. The Austrians overplay their hand, which causes the war. The Serbs refuse the order of troops, but they need Russia to do that, which causes the war. And then Austria, in responding to this, then consults Germany. The Kaiser's on his way to his vacation on his yacht, and he, in a moment of incautious emotion, not that that was ever uncommon for Kaiser Wilhelm II, Wilhelm says, Franz Ferdinand was a friend. You bet we'll back your play. So it is only a fourth or fifth level responsibility that Germany has for causing the war. But that's not enough to get Germany to pay the money. So, the war guilt clause is written into the Treaty of Versailles, which says that Germany caused the war and accepts responsibility for it. Now, there are peoples and cultures in this world. If you ask the Greeks to accept responsibility for something they didn't do, but they felt they had to do it, they'd do it. They're Greeks. They don't really care about the legalities. If you asked the Brazilians, they'd probably do it if they could find a way for it not to be a slur on their national honor. It's kind of hard when you're talking about responsibility for the war. Stereotypes, oh God, this is unpolitically correct, have a basis in some reality. I have some Irish ancestors. They tend to like to drink the whiskey. They tend to like to argue and fight because they're Irish. Okay? I have some French ancestry. And they like eating the snails and speaking the French. And I have Spanish ancestry, and they love Don Quixote and Cervantes, but they also tend to be very hardcore, fanatical discipline. So we're asking the Germans, with all of their national characteristics, to accept moral and legal responsibility for a war they didn't cause. How will Germans react to this? Think of the stereotypical German. What is one of German stereotype qualities? What is something that, I mean, some of you have German ancestry, Miss Gerdes.
Strong-willed.
Strong-willed.
Stubborn.
And
Short-tempered.
scrupulously detail-oriented.
Oh yeah.
Scrupulously detail-oriented. It's one of the reasons why, if my life ever had to depend on a piece of equipment, I wouldn't mind if that equipment came from Germany or Japan. Because the Germans and Japanese, each for cultural reasons, are both fanatical about getting all of the details right. And you are asking, therefore, absolutely compulsive, detail-oriented people to accept moral and legal responsibility for a war they didn't cause. No, that's not going to bother the Germans. No. So as much as the British fight against the French desire for revanche, the British insistence on German war guilt is going to doom any notion of a generous peace. The Germans are going to be absolutely resentful. They are. So that's the British. They have a duality of purpose. They want a generous peace, but they want the war paid. That requires war guilt. Now we come to Leti. Remember the guy with the walrus mustache I showed you yesterday?
Yes.
Georges Clemenceau. Georges Clemenceau, in addition to his hatred for Catholic education, yes, he did get rid of Catholic education in France. He was a great secularizer. Remembered this is a very old man, remembered the humiliation of 1871, and he wants revanche. Now, everyone knows that if France wins the war, it's getting Alsace-Lorraine back. But despite Wilson's college professor idealism, and despite the duality of David Lloyd George's desire for a generous peace where Germany accepts moral guilt for the war, which isn't really theirs, the French understand the reality on the ground. One of the reasons that made France so dangerous in the time of the Revolution and Napoleon is that France had a bigger population than any other European country except Russia. As a result, the French had more military and economic capability than anyone else. This is no longer the case. Germany, remember, unified is a colossus that looms over Europe. And they're still there. Honestly, Clemenceau wants Germany divided, back the way it used to be before Bismarck. But that's not going to happen. Clemenceau is afraid that the Anglo-Saxons, the British and the Americans, are going to leave France alone in a continent with Germany. And that Germany will want its payback against France. And the better part of the war was fought on French territory, the French economy was damaged, and the French generations were withered. France doesn't have the vigor to stand up to Germany anymore. Not for a while. Not until it regenerates. So France, on the one hand, wants revanche for 1871, revenge, but they also want security. And they don't care about any of this nonsense. They want land or they want restrictions. So, in addition to Alsace-Lorraine, the French insist on holding on to a region known as the Saar, which I just told you about. It's a coal and iron-rich area on the border of Alsace-Lorraine and Germany, and the Saar is going to be administered by the French until the early 1930s, and then the people will get what's called a plebiscite, which is a vote to decide whether they want to become part of France or Germany. But in addition to that, Clemenceau insists that the Rhineland be demilitarized. Now, that's all the land west of the Rhine, as well as key spots east of the Rhine. The German army, the German military, is not going to be allowed anywhere within this Rhineland region. Instead, Allied troops will occupy it, French, British, and Americans. There are Americans occupying parts of Germany as late as the late 1920s or early 1930s. So, Clemenceau gets his revenge. He also gets the Little Entente, which is a defense alliance including the Czechs and the Poles and others, that say that if Germany goes to war with anyone, they go to war with all of them. And the thing about the Petite Entente is it's not only a cordon sanitaire, sanitary zone against the Bolsheviks, it's also surrounding Germany. It is a weapon that the French have to deter German aggression. Okay. Another thing that Versailles is going to insist upon is that Germany is going to have no air force. No air force. The Germans had used Zeppelins and bombers to bomb London. No Air Force whatsoever. Number one. Number two, the Germans will have no modern dreadnought battleships or battle cruisers. They're allowed to keep 4 pre-dreadnought, ancient, obsolete battleships for coast defense, but no modern dreadnought battleships or battle cruisers. They're also not allowed to have submarines, because remember what the U-boats did. So no submarines, no Air Force, no dreadnought battleships. They're not allowed to have tanks, no armored fighting vehicles. And their army, and this is going to seem like a lot to you, Americans, but it's really not. The entire German Reichwehr, the German military, the German army, is limited in size to 100,000 men. That's all. 100,000 men. Now, you might say, that's more than twice the population of Coeur d'Alene. That's almost twice the population. That's a lot of men. No. By European standards, 100,000 men is a police force, not a military. The Germans have been disarmed. The dagger has been taken out of their hands. No Air Force, no modern Navy with modern warships or submarines, no tanks, and an army that is tiny, tiny small. What's the result of this in Germany? Well, first of all, unlike the Congress of Vienna, the new German government is not a part of this peace treaty. The French monarchy, remember, after Napoleon, took part in negotiating the Congress of Vienna. So the French were on board. But when the Germans go to the peace conference, they're basically left in a hotel. And they're told to stay away until the terms are brought to you. Instead of being part of negotiating the peace, the delegation is going to be told, take it or leave it. And if you leave it, we're going to restart the war and invade your country. Already, this is a bad sign. The Germans are not part of the solution. When they get the terms, the Germans can't believe it. Actually, the leader of their diplomatic delegation resigns rather than bring this home, because it is humiliating. The Germans have to agree to war guilt. The Germans have to agree not to be able to defend themselves in a continent that has the Bolsheviks just one country away. The Germans lose Alsace-Lorraine. That's kind of expected. But they lose part of Silesia, they lose Posen, they lose West Prussia, they lose Danzig, they lose Memel, the little spur north of East Prussia. This is called the frontier crime. There are monuments at the old borders that say in German, or at the new borders that say in German, remember German, never forget what was done in the name of hate. Never forget the frontier crime. And that is the Germans believe that their country was carved up. They see the hypocrisy in Wilson insisting on national self-determination, except for the Austrian Germans, who should, they think, be part of Germany now. Now, if this sounds sort of weepy-whiny, given that the Germans were really harsh to the Russians when they had their peace, there's something else. If you're in a fight with somebody, does it matter who wins or loses? Yes or no?
Yes.
Why? Why does it matter who wins or loses?
Well, like what kind of fight are we talking about?
Oh, any kind. Physical, verbal.
So if it matters because, especially in a physical fight, you can lose like lots of things. So if you lose in a physical fight, you can lose like
Your
a
teeth.
limb. You can
Your nose.
or like
Be
brain
broken. Yeah, all sorts of things. But also, based on who wins or loses a fight or an argument, how does that shape what comes afterwards?
Usually the person who won will be like, well, I won that one time, so I win now.
That's right. To the victor goes the spoils. If you win a fight, you get to determine what happens afterwards, at least largely. You can overplay your hand. It's good to be generous in victory, but yeah, if you win, you have the initiative, right? Do the Germans believe that they lost the war? Do they think that they lost in a fair fight? Do they think that therefore they need to be treated like a defeated nation? Here we get to the psychology. Remember, we don't live in the real world. We're not animals. We don't live in the real world. We live in a world of artificial culture. We look at each other, these imaginative things that we have about ideals, freedom, rights, all this stuff. That's the world we live in. Money. Animals don't have money. Animals live in a basic physical world. Eat or be eaten. Hide and breed and eat or be eaten. But human beings' beliefs shape reality. What is the story the Germans tell themselves about the end of the war? And I've waited until this point because it really matters. At the end of the war, German troops were in what is today the Donetsk River Basin, which is the eastern Ukraine, which has been ruled by Russia for about a decade. That's how far east they are. In the west, German troops are still in France and Belgium. That's at the war's end. On November 11th, 1918. So if you look at a map, you say, okay, the Allies won, but look, we're still in occupation of all this land. Number one. So why did the Kaiser abdicate? Why do we surrender? I know. We were stabbed in the back. Stabbed in the back. Who benefited? Who took over the new government? Friedrich Ebert, a socialist, became the new Chancellor of Germany. Socialists and their fellow travelers became the rulers of Germany right after the war. They benefited. Who's allied with the socialists? The Bolshevik communist Russians. Also, many of the Bolshevik leaders, like Leon Trotsky, and many of the German socialist leaders were Jewish. So it wasn't the German army that lost the war. We were stabbed in the back. We was robbed. The Jews and the socialists stabbed us in the back, betrayed us to our enemies. And now our enemies are treating us like we had been beaten, but we weren't beaten. Now, I saw this after Vietnam. Remember, crazy though I am, I think that Vietnam was a righteous war, terribly badly fought. And one of the things that people who thought that it was a worthwhile war might say is that the American military we never really lost a major battle in the field. We won every time we engaged the enemy on a large scale. But we lost the war. Why? Because the anti-war movement, which did have socialists and communists and others, convinced the American people it was an unworthy war, a war not worth fighting. So a person with the delusions that I have might say, well, we didn't lose the war in Vietnam. We lost the war at Berkeley, and we lost the war at other American college campuses, and we lost the war on NBC and ABC and CBS TV. We lost the war in America, and there's truth to that. This notion that we didn't lose is extremely seductive if you've lost. Have you ever played a game of chess or Risk with someone? And after you beat them, they say, well, the phone kept ringing. The kids were playing in the background. The dog came in. I didn't lose. I was distracted. Have you ever encountered that kind of bad sportsmanship? Because it's pretty common. And I hate it. Just own up. You win some, you lose some. You take your best shot and you move on. And you congratulate the victor. Good job. You kicked my butt. Well done. Next time, I'm going to try to do the same to you. That's the way it should be. Not, you didn't beat me. But it's seductive because we don't want to be wrong. We want to be right. We don't want to lose. We want to win. So the German people, a significant critical mass of them, refused to accept that they were defeated. Instead, the stab in the back theory is current. Now, if you believe that, if you believe Germany never really lost the war, get it? What happens is all of these penalties that Germany is going to have to pay are unrighteous. They are wrong. And people who are treated with injustice, this is another thing about human nature. We don't like to be messed with. We don't like to be treated unjustly. It creates an anger and an outrage in the German politics, in Germany's arts, in everything that the Germans are going to do after the war. They are, a critical mass of them are furious. Because they fought hard, they fought well, they fought for Kaiser and God, and what happens? They get betrayed by elements inside their country, and now Germany is brought low. It's not fair, it's not right, it must be avenged. And that is going to be key in making the Versailles Treaty a major cause of the Second World War. The anger with which the Germans receive it, and the fact that they will not reconcile to it, because they don't think they lost. And because the victors were all over the place. Now, what this does is it creates balkanization. Write this down, balkanization. The division of a region into microstates, balkanization. It's in your notes. It is item C. The division of a region into microstates. The division of a region into microstates. Balkanization is named after the Balkan Peninsula and the Balkan mountain range, and this area of Eastern Europe that is deeply mixed between a bunch of very small cultures and nations. So Eastern and Central Europe are now balkanized in that you have this region that used to be just 3 countries, now close to a dozen. Balkanization. Balkanization is going to create a power vacuum. It's also going to create an economic problem. Because they didn't build the railroads. The railroads were built by the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So, in order to ship something from this area, here, north of Serbia, up to Slovakia, instead of having a rail network that has this new set of nations in mind, you've got to bring your goods from here to Vienna, from Vienna to Prague, and from Prague to Slovakia. Because the original rail system was built by a unified empire, not a bunch of divided successor states. So there's a power vacuum, the economies and militaries are going to be weak, and the economies are going to be further weak because the economic network is designed for something other than what exists. Okay, another element of the League of Nations idealism, of Wilson's idealism. What do we call those areas of Africa, Asia, that are ruled by the Europeans? Word for it. What's the word for it? Colonies. Colonies. Well, after World War I, remember Lawrence of Arabia, the French want to rule Syria. The British get Palestine, Transjordan, and Iraq. The South Africans get Southwest Africa. The British want Tanzania. In the old days, they just become colonies. But not anymore. You got to have a new world order, a new legalism. So instead, these territories are awarded to the victorious powers, not as colonies, but are what is called League of Nations mandates. The difference between a colony and a League of Nations mandate is this. Colonies basically are whatever the mother country wants them to be. Mandates have the mother country promise the League of Nations that they will develop the economy and the society of these colonial regions so that someday they'll become independent members of an international community. It's the difference between having a slave and having an apprentice. If I'm a blacksmith and I have a 12-year-old kid working for me, sweeping up my areas, if they're a slave, they just sweep up my areas and keep everything clean and do what I say or I'll beat them. If they're an apprentice, every workday I've got to teach them something. I have a moral and legal obligation to instruct them so that when they're a certain age, about your age or a little older actually, they can become a journeyman blacksmith. They can get the skills to go out into the world and make nails and make hammers and do all the sorts of things to make a living. That's an apprentice, not a slave. An apprentice is a student over a long period of time, and they have to work as part of their being a student. The League of Nations mandates in Namibia, in Tanzania, in the various other colonies, and in Syria and Jordan and Palestine and Iraq, the League of Nations makes the mother countries of these empires promise that they will train the natives so that eventually, in a few generations, they will be able to take their place within the civilized nations of the world. Now, that's extremely idealistic, and would that it had been done. But basically, it is something that the mother countries promised, but they didn't really act on until after World War II. And by then, it was too late. Where we are going to leave it is the question. The treaty has been negotiated. The Germans have had to accept it because the only alternative would be an Allied invasion of Germany. What will the Americans do? Wilson was a leading light in setting up this treaty. But here's a hint. Woodrow Wilson doesn't bring a single Republican with him to Europe. And the Senate, which has to ratify any treaty, is controlled by Republicans. You can see where this is going.
That looks like a problem.
Yeah.
So we'll talk about that tomorrow. Any questions, comments, or thoughts? Okay, you can talk among yourselves until dismissal. Thank you.
Make a shirt that says